Hello, this is Yuris Kaja in Latvia. Time again to update what's going on here and to say a few things about what's going on in the country where I sort of grew up and got my college education, that is the United States. In Latvia, we are looking forward on the June the 9th to the end of the state of emergency that was declared in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic. This means there will be some changes, but there will be no dramatic changes. Over the past couple of days, the Latvian parliament, or the Saima, has been debating and trying to sort of fine tune an enabling bill that would allow the government to do a lot of what it was able to do because of a state of emergency. It would be just the cabinet of ministers deciding certain restrictions on public activities, whether there could be, whether schools and educational institutions could be fully opened, the size of public gatherings, and all that kind of stuff would be still up to the government based on what they say are epidemiological data and experts, which was not uncontroversial because even some parliamentarians who belong to the governing coalition here in Latvia said that they were a bit worried about giving over so much power to the cabinet of ministers, which is a five-party coalition, and it represents a fair section of the political spectrum here in Latvia. But nonetheless, uh, this was worrisome to some, especially as not only could the cabinet of ministers make decisions about these kind of restrictions continuing or being eased or being adjusted, it can also do a lot in dividing up government funds. Essentially, as one person said, taking away the funding approval function of the parliament. Well, I don't know if it goes that far, but anyway, this thing seems to have passed over the past few hours as I speak. So we'll see what happens. Lithuania will lift its state of emergency on June the 16th, and Estonia has already sort of let it go. Plus, Poland seems to have opened its borders, or at least there are rumors going that claims by the Prime Minister of Lithuania that he has negotiated an open border to the Baltics, an open travel with Poland. So things are changing. Well, meanwhile, back in the U.S., we have things going on there that have not been seen since the long hot summers of the 60s. And the reason is that there are a number of things that have probably not really changed since the long hot summers of the 60s in the terms of how black people or African Americans or whatever one prefers to call them are treated by the police in a lot of places. Not everywhere. I don't think things are as bad as they were in the so-called ghettos of the 1960s, but nonetheless, when a man is basically smothered in one way or another by a guy putting a knee on his neck while this suspect has his hands handcuffed behind his back, well, that is a classic example of police brutality by the officer doing that, and of what I would call almost depraved indifference by the other three police officers standing around him, whose duty actually would be to restrain a colleague who was doing something that was obviously wrong. I mean, this man was saying he can't breathe. George Floyd is his name. Say his name. And they just continue to watch all that happen. So I am not surprised that there are massive protests everywhere in the U.S., and it's a good sign. It's a sign that people are sick and tired of of all that's going of a lot that's going on, and are willing to take to the streets and are willing to risk getting hit with gas and clubs and threats of the military, which is a pretty remarkable thing because the military has been used against so-called civil disorders very, very rarely in American history, and that is not the function of the military. The function of the military is to protect the country in times of war, war being attacked by a foreign power, and of course the U.S. military has done a fairly good job of that. If we forget about Vietnam, and maybe even forget about the latest two wars in the Middle East, which resulted in more chaos and disruption. But I'm really worried about how far this could go. We may see, unless brakes are put on the president, we may see this country, or not this country, Latvia, but the country USA, which I can also refer to sort of as this country for me, descend into kind of authoritarianism on one side, more police and militarized police brutality against demonstrators, against people in the street, and on the other hand, the threat of a kind of quasi low intensity civil war. Now, obviously, one of the worst things that's happening is that private businesses and small businesses and whatnot are being smashed and looted and all of that, which means that there's a number of people, just simply the wild in the streets phase of this has started. Um, However, when you think about the fact that institutions like police precincts are attacked or when police vehicles are burned, now I'm not saying that, go out and do it, but I'm saying those who have gone out and done it at least have the motive of going after the symbols and institutions of power that represent kind of institutionalized violence against at least certain communities in Latvia. And now, of course, I mean, not in Latvia, obviously, in the U.S. And now, of course, they represent institutionalized violence against everybody. I mean, clearing the street with shock grenades and with some kind of smoke, maybe not CS gas, but certainly an irritant smoke, and also spraying people with pepper spray and hitting people with clubs, simply so that the president could go stand in front of a church holding a Bible, is pretty outrageous. He could have gone there any time that he wants. He could have gone there for religious services if he wanted to affirm his sympathies for that Church of the Presidents or whatever it was called. He could have done it any other day when it would not have necessitated creating a massive confrontation such as occurred a few days ago. And I would not be surprised if this kind of protest movement goes on, and if the police or certain elements of the military are actually really used in a harsh way against people, that somebody within these structures is going to say, no, we refuse. We remember Nuremberg. Well, it's a little exaggerated, but we are not going to carry out illegal orders to fire on, even if it's with non-lethal weapons, on our own people. So does somebody want a revolt or a mutiny within the army? Does somebody want to escalate and crank up the tension to that point? No, I think what the military and the police all have to do is to try to de-escalate this situation as much as possible and to move quickly on to addressing the fundamental problems. Or the immediate causative problem is apparently terrible policing and terrible police practices and racism in the police in a lot of places in the US. And the other bigger underlying problem is, of course, the inequality and both racially in terms of class that we see in the United States that we don't see in a lot of the sort of social democratic European countries. Not that it doesn't exist, but that is something that we should, the U.S. should address very quickly, unless it wants this to repeat itself again in 5 or 10 years, or maybe even sooner. Social media, new means of communication, make it a lot more easy to run as I said, a low intensity civil war against the government if you want to. Well, that's what I feel about what's going on back in the states. I don't follow events in the states very precisely. I've gotten into a couple of arguments on Twitter with a kind of old classmate and friend who sort of leans toward the other side of these issues, but that this is how I see it. This is how I think about it. So this is Juris Kaja, Latvian American.